So how did other voices become shut down? Why did they become ineffective? Because there was kind of experts in the field that you work alongside with Collateral Global, Shunetra Gupta, Professor Jay Bhattacharya, Professor John Ioannidis. They are experts in the field which would be very directly relevant to a pandemic and how we view it.
Martin Kulldorff, who works on vaccine safety.
Absolutely. At Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, not, they should have been very much leading, or at least a big voice in this, relevant experience from very...
I mean, I agree with everything you say.
Why did they not get a hearing among governments?
I think it comes back to some of the things we've discussed already. I think the Trusted News Initiative had a very important part to play in this. And let's go back to the W.H.O. As I mentioned, the 25th of February report of the W.H.O. said that all countries should follow this model, the Chinese model, regardless of their impact. So that was the scientific advice of the WHO. And the Trusted News Initiative decided very early that WHO advice was the science.
Did that influence what happened on Facebook, on Twitter?
It did, because they were also signed up to the Trusted News Initiative.
So they had to censor. I remember in your book you mentioned Martin Kulldorff wrote something about people wearing masks, older people having a false sense of security, and he had his Twitter account suspended for that, which was not unfactual. It was. So there was an illusion of consensus.
So I think that's very important. And this is very important. The book is called The COVID Consensus, but it is an illusion, because what we also point out in the book is that actually, there's a huge amount of scientific research, peer-reviewed scientific research, which doesn't go along with the COVID consensus.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which has pointed out all the problems with, and the ways in which lockdowns were ineffective, the ways in which they did aggravate existing healthcare problems. Things around vaccines and the impact of mandates and what those may mean for future vaccine uptake. So there's a lot of
material,
a lot of peer-reviewed scientific publications out there, but you won't be hearing about much of those in the mainstream media, because there is this idea of a single narrative, and I think let's think about definitions of, for example, totalitarian thought. Well, totalitarian thought, by its definition, doesn't allow alternatives, and that's what we've seen.
Yeah. So would you say it's kind of scary that we had a grouping of big tech, pharmaceutical industry, politics, science, all wrapping up this one unifying voice to create one narrative, which actually did great harm to many people? The fact that happened could happen again.
Well, of course it could. At the same time, one of the things that happens, I mean, as a historian, I look at this, and I look at this historically. There've been it's not the first time that people have tried to create single overarching narratives. It happened, for example, in Spain and Portugal in the era of the Inquisition. And, in those days, the heresy was around religion rather than science. But of course, it happened in the 20th century. But this structure of control has existed in varying human societies at various points in history, and there clearly is an element of humanity which can tend in that direction. But on the other hand, there's a large swathe of humanity which will sooner or later generally start to resist in various different ways. And I think we did also see that during the pandemic in various different ways. Even though they often weren't covered by the mainstream media, there were large protests about whole ranges of things, from lockdowns to vaccine mandates. And we did start seeing people, not going along with recommendations or advice around using face coverings everywhere you might go. And eventually, so I think, politically there may be a fantasy of total control, but that doesn't really deal with the messy nature of human lives and what actually happens.
Yeah.
So one example of that might be, I was talking to a friend who's from the Balearic Islands, and he said, we had all these mandates, vaccine mandates in Spain and mask rules, but he said, in his hometown, you know, you just go into the local shop if you hadn't been vaccinated, it didn't matter, you know. But that's not actually how human societies operate, fundamentally. You know, for example, let's look at West Africa, a place I know well. You know, are senior figures from the Gates Foundation or from the Wellcome Trust really going to spend much time on the ground in small towns in West Africa trying to make sure this stuff actually happens? And of course they're not. So actually enforcing this is a different thing to theorising it and developing nice spreadsheets.